Welcome, everyone, to today's version of the Center for Family-Owned Businesses webinar with First Bank. My name is Ed Hart, the director of the Center for Family-Owned Businesses. Along with our executive director, Joe Ambrose, and our entire executive team, I'd like to welcome you. We do these webinars on a regular basis designed with one thing in mind, and that is to educate family businesses around the world. Whether you're a client of the bank or not, whether you're in the United States or worldwide, the content of these webinars, we believe, will present and create a lot of value for you as you run your family business. The topic today is on conflict. And if you live in a family or work in a business, you've got conflict. And a lot of us talk about the idea of conflict resolution or conflict management. Today, our presenter, who I'll introduce to you here momentarily, Josh Barron, will talk to us about how we can creatively and constructively use the conflict that we have in our lives, and specifically within a family-owned business. Before we get started and I bring Josh on screen, we're going to just show you a quick 30-second video from our chairman, Michael Dierberg, just talking a little bit about the bank and about the center and why the center exists. We'll come back, I'll give a couple of thoughts, and then we'll bring on Josh. So sit back, relax, enjoy this message from Michael Dierberg, and I'll be right back.
Family business is so much more than just business as usual. It takes an entirely different mindset, a different vision. You know a bright future is found in strong traditions. You see the freedom in looking further down the road. As part of the fourth generation of my family to help lead First Bank, I know we share your vision. That's why we've created the First Bank Center for Family-Owned Businesses to share our experience with monthly webinars, tailored products, tools, and education specific to family-owned businesses. Your vision is our vision. Let our experience be yours. Let's see what your future can be.
As Michael mentioned on the video, we are a fourth generation privately held family-owned business owned by the Dierberg family. What that means to you is, as a family business, we are not only a bank who can serve your banking needs, but we also are a family-owned company facing a lot of the very similar issues that you may be facing as a family business owner. One of those, as we talked about before the video, is this topic of conflict. Anytime we do a survey or have a conversation with a family business about what are some of the issues that you may be facing, it doesn't take very long in that conversation for the word conflict to come up. So as we talked with Josh Barron and talked about various topics that we could address today on this webinar, conflict was one that came to his mind, as it has with us as well. A little bit about Josh. He is the co-founder and a senior advisor with Banyan Global, a worldwide family business consulting firm. He's also a professor at the Harvard Business School. Josh will be presenting along with the previous webinar speaker that all of you have seen or heard of, Dennis Jaffe. Dennis and Josh will be co-leading our Family Business Symposium next month up in Santa Barbara, California. We're excited, Josh, to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. Love to pick your brain more, but right now, we'll do that another time. But right now, I'd like to just turn the time over to you and appreciate you sharing your wisdom and expertise and research on this wonderful word conflict. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you, Ed. Really appreciate the invitation to come and spend some time with you and all the guests, and really a big believer in the work that you all are doing. Family businesses are such a critical part of the economy, and the more that we can sort of talk about some of these issues, the better. And that's really what we'll spend our time today discussing, is this idea of conflict. And in particular, we'll talk about four different sort of concepts. One is we'll talk about the title of this, the Goldilocks zone of conflict. I'll explain what I mean by that. And then we're going to get into talking about how do you manage conflict? What are some strategies that you can use inside of your family business to do that? We'll talk about, how do family feuds happen? No one wants them to happen, and yet they do. What is the process? And really the goal of talking about that is to inform the last subject, which is, how do you avoid a family feud? And this is a topic that, very much, is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. 6-7 years ago, I designed a class at Columbia Business School called Managing Conflict in Family Businesses, and I still teach on the subject at Harvard. So it's a really, really important topic to discuss and to get on the table for family businesses. But why is that? Why do we spend so much time talking about conflict? I also teach strategy for all companies, and we don't spend a lot of time talking about conflict in that setting. What is it about family businesses that really brings this issue to the forefront? And the reason is because the potential for conflict, severe conflict, the family feuds and so on, is really part of a family business. There's lots of wonderful, positive, amazing attributes of family businesses, but there also is this potential conflict. And just to kind of give you a sense as to why is it that happen? Why is it that happens? First of all, there's a level of interdependence. So as a family, you own stuff together. You have shared ownership. And because unlike a family that doesn't own things together, like my family, because of that, there's all kinds of other potential issues that you can have disagreements about. And that can be everything from, who has which roles to who gets paid a different amount of money. Some of the worst conflicts I've seen are actually not about the business, but about the family vacation home or the family, the boat that everyone owns, and disagreeing about who gets to use it over the holidays, or who left the lights on in the house. Those kinds of questions. So there's more reasons to have disagreement. The other is that although there's lots of positive things about being in a family, it's important that we acknowledge that there's also some very natural competition that happens inside of a family. All of us are born with this need to do what psychologists call individuating, which is creating a space that is us, that is about us, as opposed to about our families. If you have kids who are, going through the terrible twos, or teenagers, a lot of that is about them defining themselves separate from their parents. It's a very normal process, but what people who aren't part of a family business do when they grow up is they typically leave home and they create their own careers. But when you're part of a family business, it's oftentimes hard to really know this success that we've had. What is that? Is that, it's great, I'm really proud of it, but what about me? And then we're also sort of competing for, with our siblings, with others, for respect and attention, all that kind of stuff. Very normal dynamics that happen among siblings in particular. And you would think that because family businesses are often successful and they're wealthy, that all this stuff would just go away. But it turns out it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is because humans are fundamentally social creatures. We actually judge ourselves not on sort of an absolute standard, but always relative to someone else. Think about the expression "keeping up with the Joneses." I feel really good about my new lawnmower until I see my neighbor got an even nicer one. Now I don't feel so good about that. And I was in a conversation recently, and someone said, I really am happy with my $12 million ski house, but then I saw my cousin's $24 million ski house. I didn't like mine quite so much anymore. And that dynamic is there. It's part of the equation. The other is that, one of the things that makes family businesses different from other kinds of businesses is that they're owned by people who are related to each other. And ownership is a really, really powerful thing. It brings with it, if you own something, it means you get to make the rules about sort of who gets what and how things work. And if you can make the rules, it also means that you can break the rules. And the consequence of that is that when we have conflict inside of a family business, it can just kind of keep going. No one's going to come in and tell you to stop, unless you get to the point of a lawsuit and a judge. But that's gone pretty far by that point. And then the last thing is that there's a lot at stake. We're talking about, the golden goose. And as one of the families I know described this, the golden goose lays two eggs. There's the financial egg, the financial value, but there's also the family relationships and connections, the reasons to be part of a family business. And so because of that, there's a lot on the line. So there's, consequences for these decisions. You can't easily just walk away if things aren't going your way, but it also can often say, we actually can keep it. There's something worth fighting over. And you'll see these conflicts that can go on for a long period of time. So I think just to start by trying to normalize this a bit and say, we shouldn't be surprised when conflict happens inside a family business. The potential for it is always going to be present. We can't just wish it away. And I think sometimes people, when I sort of work with families who are in conflict, the first thing we kind of talk about is, you're not, there's nothing unusual about you. There's nothing broken in your family. This is actually kind of just part of the way it works. And it's why it's important to have conversations like this about how to manage it. So when conflict goes really bad, it's not, too much, surprising to say, this has a big effect on the business, on the broader enterprise, on the family. When there's too much conflict, it affects the ability to grow, to innovate. Decision making starts to suffer. The company can lose its competitive edge because you're focusing on fighting with each other and not externally thinking about the business. And it can lead to separations, the lawsuits, the buyouts, all those kinds of things. The family relationships also suffer when conflict gets too severe. Most of us don't like being in an environment where people are yelling and screaming at each other. So we tend to retreat. We kind of find the people where we can get along. And oftentimes that spills over across generations. It doesn't just stay put. And the net result is relationships that are not very positive, both for those that are fighting, as well as for those who are stuck in the middle. Okay, so too much conflict is clearly a problem. You probably didn't need me to tell you that. What's interesting, though, is if you ask the question on the other extreme, what happens if we have too little conflict? And I'm guessing most of you have been in a situation like this at some point in your lives, where there's some big issue, we call that the elephant in the room. There's something happening here, but we're all just tiptoeing our way around it. We're walking on eggshells. We're trying to do everything we can to not talk about this thing that's right in front of us, right? And when that happens, and you kind of think about what are the consequences of that, well, it turns out they're basically the same. That when we have too little conflict, that also affects the ability of the company to grow and innovate. We can't actually have the kind of productive disagreements where innovation actually happens. We can't actually work together, so decision-making suffers. The company can lose its competitive advantage because you can't adapt. The market is changing, but you're stuck in the mud because you don't want to talk about difficult issues. And then over time, people can disengage. They don't want to be part of a situation that's not dynamic, where they can't actually bring their full enthusiasm and excitement to the business. And so they leave over time, and the business suffers. Families also tend to suffer in that environment. It's actually, when you think about who you have to be to avoid conflict, it's really hard to be your authentic self. You have to be like a version of that's not going to set anyone off. And that's not so fun either. So again, we tend to retreat to safety. We go find people that we don't have to worry that if we make we say the wrong word or phrase or do the wrong thing, that's going to set off an entire disagreement. And then relationships also suffer. It's kind of like the iceberg. We just get the stuff on the surface, and everything interesting is happening underneath. So too much conflict, too little conflict are both going to lead to the same ultimately negative consequences for a family business. And that's when we get to this idea of a Goldilocks zone. And I'm guessing many of you have heard of the fairy tale of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, where one bed is too big and one bed is too small and one bed is just right. I actually find it useful to think about this term in the way that astronomers use the idea of a Goldilocks zone. And what they say is, look, if the Earth was much closer to the sun, it would be too hot for life to exist. And so think about that: too hot, too much conflict, right? Too much going on. There's just, things aren't settled enough for life to evolve and be successful. On the other hand, if the Earth was much further away from the sun, it would be too cold. There'd be not enough vitality, not enough action for life to be sustainable. Think about that as too little conflict. I want you to associate that with the too cold. And somewhere in the middle, it's not a specific point. It's somewhere in the middle is this zone where it's just right, where we have enough conflict for things to be healthy. And it's important to think about that as a zone, because every family is different. I remember teaching a class a few years ago, and I had a student from Italy, and she raised her hand, and she said, what you all call conflict, we just call normal dinner conversation, right? And every family is a little bit different in how they think about that, but there's some zone in the middle where we're having enough disagreement, enough conversation, but it's not so much that it becomes uncomfortable. And that's what we're going to think about, when you're in a family business. Oftentimes the stories we tell about family businesses, the newspaper articles or the TV shows like Succession and Yellowstone, Dynasty, Dallas, there is a whole genre of shows and movies that are all about families fighting and doing horrible things to each other. And I hope that's not in your situation, but if it is, then the goal is to figure out how to reduce the intensity. My experience working with families around the world is that's actually usually not the problem. Oftentimes, families place a really high premium on harmony. But going back to what I said before, because there are always going to be real issues to disagree about, it's actually not a real harmony. It's a veneer. It's actually not, it's not a sort of actual getting along. It's there through avoidance. And most families, therefore, actually have to learn how to disagree, to learn how to have enough conflict that is healthy and constructive and doesn't set things off in a negative direction. Now, the thing you want to watch out for is kind of the bouncing back and forth. So if you think oftentimes families will ignore, sweep under the rug an issue until it becomes so in your face about it that you have to say something and you explode and there's a big argument, right? And then you say, well, that wasn't fun. We're not doing that again. And so everyone goes back and doesn't talk about it again. And you kind of just cycle back and forth between having, not enough discussion and these really unconstructive conversations. So really learning how to have that space in the middle. What does that look like? Well, here's just to share an example. I'm guessing many of you have come across Sierra Nevada. It's a microbrewery company. And like many family businesses, it brands itself around being a family business. But it also does something that I've never seen before, which actually brands itself around family conflict. Their tagline is family owned, operated, and argued over. And when the founder was asked to sort of say, why did you choose that? He said, it's funny, but it's the truth. We can get together and argue over what's best for us as a company moving forward, but we all do it in good faith, knowing that everyone wants what's best overall. And I think if you can say some version of that, then you actually probably have found that Goldilocks zone. All right, so that's the goal. It's actually not to avoid conflict, to eliminate conflict. Those are not possible. We have to learn how to manage it and find some space in the middle. How do you do that? Well, let me walk you through some strategies that you can use in your family business to find that space in the middle. And again, going back to the idea that family businesses are just packed full of stuff that has both financial consequence, emotional consequence, that hold the potential for conflict. We can't just wish it away. And so this idea of a family that is just perfectly harmonious is a myth. And it's actually kind of an unhelpful myth because it makes us think that when conflict or issues are either overt, in our family or they're beneath the surface, that we're doing something wrong. And these strategies are things you can use like a thermostat to raise or lower the temperature. And I mean that mostly figuratively, but actually to some extent literally, in the sense that there's a lot of research that says that when the temperature goes up, so does conflict. And there's like a biological reaction that we have to higher temperatures. And so if you're going into a meeting that you think is going to be really, really intense, people on the edges, going to be on the edge of their seats, just go to the thermostat, turn it down a little bit. If you're worried that people are going to be just too passive and not engaged, maybe raise the temperature a little bit. But I mean this mostly figuratively. Think about that thermostat of, too much conflict, that's the heat, too little conflict, that's the cold. These strategies are things that we can use when there's not enough conflict, which oftentimes happens in families. We have to fan the flames a little bit. We may need to use a little bit less of some of these strategies and tools. Maybe we're using too much of them. On the other hand, when there's too much conflict, that's when we have to douse the fire a little bit, so that's becoming too out of control to actually be constructive. All right, so what are these strategies? The first one is what I call partition, which is essentially creating separate spaces for family members to occupy. And that can be either within the business or in other parts of the family enterprise. So I run this business, you run that business, I run marketing, you run finance, I run the company, you run the foundation or the family office. And by the way, this is the most common organizational structure in family businesses worldwide, is these silos. And there's a reason for that. Is it going back to that point that people need their own space? If you try to do everything and sit around a table and make every decision together, it turns out that's not going to be very constructive to sort of having and finding a productive level of conflict. So really thinking about how do you find the right level of overlap? You don't want your lives to be all integrated, everything together, but also you don't want to lose the benefits that come from doing things together as a family. So looking for opportunities for people to have separate locations. I work over here, you work over there. I know lots of families that do that, and it can be very helpful. Or different entities or functions.
There's a section all panelists and audience.
We're getting a little feedback, I think, from.
That's right. I saw.
Another thing is to really try to draw some boundaries between work life and family life, as opposed to having all of those coming together, finding some what I call safety valves or just other ways of contributing that are not part of the core business. It could be new businesses or running the family meeting or philanthropy. And then also actually thinking about using, dividends, creating some sort of what you can think of as like psychological diversification, where not everything is sort of part of the business. I actually have a little bit of sort of spending money or a little bit of even some investments on my own, so that not everything is focused inward. Sometimes we try to hold people together by doing everything together, and it actually makes it harder to have a productive relationship with each other. All right, the second strategy is purpose. And this is all about finding a reason for having a family enterprise. It answers the why question, and it's a particular kind of answer. It's the kind of answer that motivates people to sacrifice their personal interest, or at least some of their personal interest, to achieve something that you can only do together. And that's really the role and the benefit that comes with having a purpose. And I came across this really interesting book. It was called High Altitude Leadership, and it looked at leadership through the lens of expeditions, like people climbing Mount Everest or climbing K2. And what the authors say is most expeditions fail on the way down, not on the way up. On the way up, we have this common goal in front of us, in this case, a mountain, that we know that only if we work together can we achieve our goal, right? And so I'm not so worried about whether you're doing a little bit less of the work or eating a little bit more of the food. I know that only by sort of sticking together can we accomplish this big goal. And they say once you reach the summit, that's when the knives come out. That's when people start sort of focusing on, well, why aren't you doing this, and why am I doing more? When you lose that sense of objective. And so one of the things you really want to focus on in your family business is thinking about that purpose, that sort of why are you in business together? What can you gain by owning the company together? And the reality is that purpose, unless you really work on it over generations, it tends to naturally decline. Because if you think about the founder of a business, and if you, as I have, you ask a founder of a business, why did you create this company? They'll kind of look at you funny and say, well, I mean, I had to. I had to put food on the table. I had to take care of my family. I had some idea that I really wanted to put down, but I had to quit my job to do it. Their founders are swimming in purpose. It's all kind of, ultimately, oftentimes the business is like, another child to them. It's oftentimes talked about as the favorite child of the family. So there's a very strong sense of why. And then the second generation, oftentimes they grew up with that. It grew up around them. But oftentimes you feel a little bit less. And by the time we get to the third or fourth generation, if we're not careful, people are talking about, well, it's a good investment, or I feel a sense of obligation. Those are okay reasons to own a business, but they're probably not going to motivate the family to make the kind of sacrifices that being part of a family business requires. So you could think about that as what's our positive purpose? Sometimes, especially when you're going through a high conflict situation, it's hard to imagine these like big, lofty things, but you can think about, what will we lose if we don't come together? Hermes, which is a family luxury company, LVMH tried to buy them like they tried to buy a lot of other luxury companies, and they actually sort of rallied around that idea. So really thinking about how do we activate the purpose in our family enterprise, and you can do that through like the kind of a standard mission, vision, value statements, but make sure that they actually like tug at your heart a bit. Like, do these actually feel like compelling reasons for owning this business together? All right, so that's purpose and the value of it. The third one I talk about is authority, and authority is all about decision making. It's really easy to do things and to act when everyone agrees, right? That's simple. What's more complicated is what happens when you don't agree. Do we do nothing? Are we kind of stuck if there's four siblings who each own 25% and they don't agree, does that mean that nothing happens, or does one person, have the ability to make those decisions, or do we vote? How does all that work, right? And so there's a real risk, and conflict can start to get out of control if we're all in charge, so no one is in charge, right? And so having an understanding, how are decisions made here ultimately, right? As I said, that power ultimately sits with the owners of the business, but how do you exercise it so that you can actually move forward when people don't agree? So, and there are different ways that families do this. Some actually say they try to kind of replicate the founder model. The founder is the one who made all the major decisions by him or herself. And there's some very sizable family businesses that continue that. They sort of say, well, everyone in the family can own, economic value, non-voting shares, but one person or a smaller subgroup are going to actually have, the voting control over the entire business. And that way we make sure that, everyone can have a voice, but it's very clear when it comes time to vote. That's one way to do it. Not recommending. It's got lots of pros and cons, like everything in life. Another way is actually to sort of really think about, how do we make decisions when we don't agree? Do we have voting procedures? Do we have a kind of consensus-based approach? Do we use an arbitrator, a mediator to help us when we get stuck? Do we have ways out? If someone doesn't, ultimately disagrees and they say, I don't want to be here anymore, is there a pathway out of the family business if they don't want to be part of it? Have we defined how decisions are made? And then the last thing is actually one of the things that can become a big challenge in a family business is that the owners actually can make all the decisions, and that just creates all kinds of space for disagreement. And so the other alternative is to delegate. And by the way, you can do more than one of these things. You delegate, and you kind of say, all right, what decisions do we really need to make as the owners of the business? What can we delegate to our board of directors or board of advisors? What do we want to delegate to our CEO, so that not everything has to come up to this place where maybe we don't agree on everything? And we have a model, it's in the book that my colleague and I wrote, called the 4-room model. And it's a way of understanding and building governance. If you want to, Ed can get you a copy of that if you'd like to read it, but it's a way of kind of building out and thinking about delegating decision making. All right, and the fourth one is actually thinking about rules. Like, how do you actually use rules to set some expectations of behavior? And these can be sort of formal formal sort of written down policies, or more sort of informal norms and ways of working together. And rules can be really helpful. Think about, if you had to make every decision from a blank sheet of paper, it can be very, very complicated. And that's why it's helpful to have a policy on, family employment and who gets which job, and how many years of experience you should have before you come in, and how is compensation determined. Going back to that vacation home, having some rules about who gets to use it in a shared calendar, just having some ways of actually navigating through decisions can make a huge difference. So what I really encourage you to do is to sort of think about your family business and say, what are some of the hot spots? What are the things that could cause some disruption in our family? And let's put some policies in place around them. Let's think about, how are we going to focus on compensation, or have a dividend policy, or when it comes time for succession, that can be a big, not just on the TV show, but in real life, succession can be a big source of conflict. Who gets which job? Do we have, a way of managing that? Or as I mentioned, some shared property or other things that can cause a lot of disagreement. The other is more, every family, has a culture, has some expectations about how things work. And sometimes they're written down, but very often they're not. And oftentimes what I've noticed is when families are going through conflict, it's almost like a culture clash between maybe one generation and the next generation. Or oftentimes it's the spouses come in and they have a different expectations for how families work and how often you're supposed to see each other, and whether parents can just drop by on the weekend to see the grandkids, or whether they should call first. I've seen lots of conflicts over those kinds of issues. And so actually capturing and writing those down and saying, like, what are the norms that we want to use in our family, and how do those evolve? How do we want to treat spouses? How do we want to think about the balance between, what you get by being born into the family versus what you get through earning it? And I actually wrote an article called Merit and Inherit that you can find on the Harvard Business Review website if you're curious for more on that topic. So I want you to think about these strategies like dials on a thermostat that you can move up and down. So let's just take this sort of picture here, which is kind of typical of a founding generation, where, there's a lot, if you kind of look in the middle of the chart, very high on that sense of purpose, as I mentioned. Also, authority tends to be very clear. I'm the founder. I own all of the shares of the company. I'm the CEO. I'm also the head of the family. Why are we going to do this? Because I said so. I mean, we could talk about it, but ultimately this is my decision. On the other hand, I probably have integrated almost everything, personal, business. It's not, it's all just one account. I haven't really separated my lives very much. I don't like rules, because if I had too many rules, I probably never would have been a founder. And that's kind of like a typical pattern that you see in that founding generation. And as you get into the second and oftentimes the third generation, you start to lose, some of that sense of purpose and authority. It goes from one person having all the control to split among 3, 4, or how many ever number of children, and so on down the line. And that's when it's important to kind of come in and say, well, we need to actually think about what should we own together versus what should we keep separate? What kind of rules do we want to have in place to manage things that, the founder just sort of did, but now we actually have to come to some consensus about. And so think about these as you can actually move these like dials in the thermostat. And ideally what you want is to find somewhere in the middle, just like you want conflict to be in that just right place. Ideally, each of these strategies finds its way somewhere in the middle. And the reason is because too much of almost anything can be really negative. Even too much of purpose, when families, it's all about the family, it's all about the business. People sort of say, well, how do I fit into that? How do I fit into that? And what about me? So too much of any of these can actually become negative. Too little, can also not be so helpful. So, thinking about for each of these individual dimensions, how do you find that just right zone? And that makes sure that you're not just reliant on one strategy, because it can go away. And that's actually what we're going to talk about next, which is how do families that love each other, that have a lot on the line, end up in these awful family feuds. And like I said, I don't think this is what most families deal with. Most families are learning, having to learn how to have disagreements, but it happens. I'm guessing most of you know a family that's been through, a lawsuit or a major disagreement. They don't talk to each other anymore. If you haven't, I'm sure you've read stories about them. So these things do happen, but I could guarantee you, none of those families thought that it was going to happen to them when they started out. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't have done it. But yet it does happen. So what is the process, right? And when we tend to think about family feuds and explaining these big conflicts, our tendency is to sort of blame individuals, to say, well, this person was really greedy, or that person broke the whole thing up. More often than not, that's actually not very helpful or correct. I was sort of struck. I watched this movie. It's on Netflix. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. It's called Downfall: The Case Against Boeing. It's about the 737 MAX, which was this big, new, sort of big bet for Boeing, new airplane that was going to revolutionize air travel. Sold, tons and tons of them. And then one of them crashed. And, of course, the first thing that happened was that everyone, including Boeing, blamed the pilot. It must have been the pilot. There's no way this amazing piece of machinery could have fallen out of the sky. And then another one crashed. And then they shut the entire program down. And it turns out that it's a lot more complicated than the pilot. There's a whole bunch of things that went wrong that caused those accidents to happen. And the same thing is true in families. We tend to make this mistake that people call the fundamental attribution error, which is essentially that whenever I do something wrong, I can give you a list of all the reasons that weren't my fault why it happened. Why was I late to work today? Well, it's because there was traffic on the highway, my car broke down, my kids are sick, and I take one to the doctor, on and on and on. When someone else makes a mistake, when they're late to work, it's because they don't care enough, right? Because when they weren't focused, it wasn't important enough for them to be at the meeting. And this is a mistake that we all tend to make. And so rather than focusing on an individual, almost all conflicts, all the ones that I've seen, are more complicated than just one person did something awful. And they tend to follow this pattern. I want you to understand the pattern so you can learn how to avoid the pattern, right? And they all start like, let's imagine that we have a family business that's somewhere in the zone. They found some version of the Goldilocks zone, and they've been using some mix of those strategies, right? So the first thing we want to do when we're trying to understand what's happened to create a family feud is say, well, why wasn't it worse before? Why was this family business able to be successful for 30 years or 130 years, and all of a sudden this conflict happened? What were the strategies that they had used to try to hold it together up until that point? Right. And then usually what happens is there's some shock, some disruption, some things happen that made those strategies no longer work anymore. And I think it's helpful to think about these like tectonic plates, right? So we're experiencing the stuff on the surface, but there's a lot that's happening underground. And there's a list on the right-hand side of common things that can disrupt sort of a nice, happy situation for a family. It could be the death of a family leader, or I just, talking to one family that where a CEO succession process has caused a huge amount of conflict to a family that had never experienced it before. Or spouses come into the picture, which is wonderful, but they have their own sets of values and expectations and so on. Or the next generation comes in, which are, again, how wonderful is that? That's the whole reason we're doing this. But now we have to talk about issues that we didn't have to before, like who gets which job and who gets how much money and so on and so forth. And so all these different things can cause a disruption to the way the family had worked before. And then more often than not, when we're experiencing a heightened level of tension, it's the result of one or more of these shocks happening. And what happens is that the strategies that we used don't work anymore. It's not because one person did something really, really negative. And what happens is it creates a feeling of insecurity. The world feels unsteady, and that insecurity is the engine of escalating conflict, right? So things don't work as they used to, and then things kind of take on a life and dynamic of their own. And that's what happens in life more broadly, but in family business is that conflict actually can start to spiral out of control. And it happens through a series of steps. If we had more time, I would walk you through this. There's also a chapter in our book that just goes through this conflict spiral in more detail, but kind of explains how we get from very simple disagreements through a series of stages all the way down to the bottom, which is family wars. And those can be lawsuits or other kinds of big disagreements. But the overall point I want to focus on is that if you leave a situation alone, more often than not, it gets worse rather than staying the same. And part of the reason is because to go from one stage to the next is actually, it makes sense. There's a reason why people do it, and yet it brings us deeper and deeper into the conflict. But ultimately, it's avoidable. As one of the families that said it, conflict is inevitable, but combat is optional. All right, so conflict has started to spiral. Eventually, sometimes after a period of time, we get to a point where people say, all right, I'm willing to sacrifice anything to get this thing over. I remember when we were fighting, I maybe don't even remember we were fighting about originally, but we need to figure out how to end this conflict and can kind of get back to normal. Unfortunately, that tends to happen in tough circumstances. People's, what your goals are tends to change only in response to some very negative feedback. We recognize that we need to actually change some of what we were hoping to accomplish before, but eventually we're able to get ourselves back to the table and say, let's just solve this thing, right? Whatever we were fighting about, it's not worth it anymore. We need to come to some sort of solution. And that's what tends to happen, is that there's ultimately, unfortunately, oftentimes after some real suffering and damage to the business, damage to relationships, people come up with a solution. It may be that you exit, we sell the business and we go our separate ways. We don't own a company together anymore. It might be that we split the company in parts, or I buy you out or you buy me out. So we're no longer in business together. Or the third one is we actually come up with what I call a grand bargain, meaning that we actually come up with a new set of tools and we address some of the root causes that had caused the conflict to happen. And through one or more of these situations, we get back to stability until the whole thing can start again. And this is just to give you an example. This is a disguised but real example from one family. that was in a big conflict. And you can kind of see, using those 4 strategies, a number of things they had to do. And don't focus on the specifics because those are particular to that family. The thing I want you to focus on is that it's not going to be just one thing. When you get into a major disagreement, there's not going to be like a silver bullet that's going to solve it. We're going to have a family constitution that's going to solve the problem. It's going to have to be a series of things that's going to get you all back to the table and being able to own the business together. Now, that all sounds awful, I hope, to you all. It's certainly, for those that I've seen go through these family feuds, it's awful to experience. So I want to close by just talking about some ways to avoid that kind of a family feud from happening in the first place. How do you kind of not get into that kind of situation to begin with when none of your options are really good options? One is, I want you to really think about conflict from an analytical perspective, which is to say that you can actually look at your family business and start to identify, especially when things are going well, right? The best time to build the house is when it's not raining, not when it's pouring outside. You can actually identify some of those vulnerabilities. And one tool you can use that is what's called a pre-mortem. The post-mortem is the thing that we do after the patient is dead to figure out what happened. The pre-mortem is the thing that we do to avoid that from happening in the first place. And what you do is you have a conversation as a family, and you say, let's imagine that 5 years from now, we are in a lawsuit with each other. It might be hard to imagine, but let's imagine it. How did that happen? What happened? How did this play out? Maybe we can look at some other families and say, how did they get there? What are some other some possible avenues through which that conflict could have happened? And then essentially you use that pre-mortem to start to build some shock absorbers. Life is going to change. People are going to come into your family. People are going to pass away. You're going to go through up times and downturns. All this stuff is going to happen. Change is the constant in life, and especially over generations. You start to say, well, how can we get ahead of that? If we know succession is going to be a huge problem, let's not wait till after to have that problem happen. Let's actually develop a succession plan or a process by which we're going to do that. Or if we know the next generation, they're 5 now, they're all playing and enjoying each other. There's no conflict, no issues. It's all great. But we know in 10 years or 15 years or 20 years, they might be knocking on the door and asking for jobs. Let's solve that now, because it's going to be a lot harder to say no to someone's kid when they're actually the one asking for a job. It's a lot easier when they're 5 and we have no idea who's going to be the next CEO and who's not. So getting out ahead of those issues can become really valuable. Learning about communication. This is something that most of us, myself included, are not naturally great at, but there's a whole bunch of great communication tools that you can sort of learn and develop those skills to help you to have those kinds of conversations that are otherwise really tough. Learning how, creating some experiences to learn how to disagree productively earlier than later in life. I know a lot of, sibling groups where their parents, ran the business until they were in their 80s or 90s. So the second generation was in their 50s and 60s by the time they actually had to make decisions without mom or dad. That's hard to learn. Better off to create some early experiences when they're kids, when they're teens, when they're in their 20s. Give them some joint projects to do, whether it doesn't really matter what it is. It could be donating money to a cause or developing a small investment fund in the stock market, but just giving them the experience of having to compromise and making decisions together can be really, really valuable. And then just sort of remembering that, there are certain times you want to think about when is the right time to have a really important conversation. We all are creatures of our environment. Like as I said, when the temperature goes up, conflict goes up, and that's sort of a universal trait. Certain things are going to create elevated levels of anxiety. So, for example, not the best time to have a really deep conversation with someone when they're about to move from one house to another. It's one of the most stressful things in life. You probably want to pick a different time to have that conversation. On the flip side, you can actually think about, how do I set up the environment to give me the best chance of having a productive conversation? How do I set up the room so that we're not antagonized at, 2 sides, on opposite sides of the table? Or when there's actually some research that says that if you want to have a conversation with someone where you want them to be open-minded, you're actually best doing something out of the ordinary. So like, instead of having that conversation with your parent or child about something difficult, instead of having in the boardroom, go for a walk. Your neural pathways open up, and so does your mind in general. So thinking about how do you actually create the context to be successful and learn how to have those tough conversations. And the last thing is just to set reasonable expectations. And one of the things that one of the biggest impediments that I've seen to the ability to find that Goldilocks zone is some unrealistic expectations that we sometimes put on family. As I said, one of them is the notion that families don't fight. They do. It's just part of the nature of it, and all kinds of reasons why family businesses are going to have a lot more to fight over than families that don't have businesses. But also, sometimes families will be sort of say, well, unless we do everything together, it's not going to keep us all together. Well, that actually can be counterproductive. And so I was in a meeting, and one member of the family raised her hand and said, doing some things on our own makes the collective stronger rather than weaker. And then just setting some expectations about, sometimes we think that to be in a family business together, you have to be best friends. And of course, if you have that, that's amazing. It's wonderful to be working with and spending time with people who are your best friends in life. But again, that's not true for everybody. And you don't have to be best friends to be in business together. And again, another family kind of member said this in a meeting. He said, look, we can be good business partners rather than best friends. Right. And then sometimes just not having that expectation can make it a lot easier to deal with some of these issues. All right. So last, just to summarize some of these key themes, and we can talk about whatever questions you have. First is look for that Goldilocks zone of conflict. Both too much and too little conflict are going to lead to the same negative outcomes. You can't avoid it. The issues are going to be there. Second is use those strategies like dials on a thermostat to find the right level of conflict and moderate that over time. Third point is understand the way that these major conflicts happen. Move away from trying to blame this person or that person and what they did or didn't do. Much more often than not, it's going to be some change that you've all experienced, whether it is the loss of a family member, the loss of the patriarch and matriarch, or COVID changed our lives and created a whole ton of additional issues and conflict. That's why you're fighting. It's not because someone did something. And you can actually use some of these tools we've talked about to be able to plan ahead and avoid family feuds from happening. So I'll stop there. Here's my contact information. If any of you would like to ever have a chat about any of these topics, feel free to email me also, or feel free to find me on LinkedIn. And with that, I'll stop sharing here, and then just Ed, where should we go?
Appreciate you sharing this with us. A few questions have come in. I jotted a couple down myself, but why don't we get to the ones that have come through on the chat? And if anybody has further questions, you can enter those into the Q&A section on the webinar as well. First of all, early on, Josh, you alluded to a book, and I didn't catch the book title and who the author was. A couple of people have asked for the author and the title again.
Oh, I think that was, the book is High Altitude Leadership. I think you could find, it's pretty easy to find it on Amazon. And that's the one that was sort of about purpose and climbing mountains and stuff. If that was one, if it was something else, let me know.
Right. We'll go back, we'll get that, and when we put this up on our website, on the First Stop Bank website, we will also put that in there. And if anybody has questions on that, you can reach out to us. All right, this is where the old guy in me has to put my glasses on and read a couple of questions that have come through. I'll just do them in order.
Yeah, sounds good.
Question is, what do you say to a family in which only one person is interested in bringing the relationship closer? In parentheses, they wrote, has never been close to his sons, doesn't want to be alone. His sons don't want anything to do with him, even in the company. How do you resolve that conflict? I know that's probably years of therapy and a lot more than 1 minute answer, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it sounds like a really tough situation that, as you said, probably there's a lot deeper issues that are worth getting into. Look, I think that oftentimes it's hard to working on relationships directly is something for therapy, and I'm not a therapist, so I'm not going to offer any advice in that direction. What I have found, though, is that actually working on some of the sort of more business and governance issues can actually help to bring people closer together. Having conversations about why do we want to own this thing together? Why do we want to do that? What are some of the concrete things that may be getting in the way? Developing some rules and policies around those. I think that's those are the kinds of tools I think can can ultimately help. But I think the other thing is, I would say, is going back to my point about setting expectations. Look, you may want it to be, and this person may want it to have a really close relationship. But first of all, the question is like, is that feasible or possible? You can't force someone to want to do that. And the question there is, what do you do if you can't? Do you want to continue to have the business together? Is it making things better or making things worse? One other family business leader I know says family businesses are never neutral. They're either they're either getting things, making things more constructive or less so. And I guess in that situation, my first question is this a healthy thing for everyone to be in business together? And if not, maybe it's time to start looking for alternatives.
Yeah, to your point, you're either moving towards resolution or away from it, right? There's always constant movement.
That's right.
The bicycle is
Absolutely.
always going up a hill or down a hill. Another
Yeah.
question that came in is, what role can a family council play in conflict resolution?
Oh, this is a great question. And, for those that aren't as familiar, family councils are kind of a governance tool that's been around now for, it's been around probably longer than that, but it's been named now for several decades. And it's a way for the family to have, it's often a subgroup of the family that gets together and talks about, policies or sort of, planning family meetings and working on, training and developing the next next generation. Doing education events, those kinds of things. And I think the family council, it can be useful in a couple of main ways. And again, as I mentioned, we use this 4-room model that talks about the difference between families, owner, board, and management. Those are the 4 rooms. One of the things I've seen that family councils get themselves in trouble is they try to solve ownership issues like dividends and buy-sell policies and so on. The family council is oftentimes not very well equipped to do that, but family councils can be really helpful. And first of all, oftentimes these conflicts are about family related issues. So I can't tell you how many times, I'm sure you, Ed, you've seen this too, where you have a business, but the big issue is about the vacation home or something like that. And it's the family or the foundation, which can be, a wonderful tool to bring people together, but can also cause tons of conflict. In fact, just as a quick aside, I was talking to a family office group, and they surveyed their members. They asked them, what are three things that bring you closer together, and 3 things that's going to tear you apart. And 2 things were on both lists: vacation homes and foundations. Right. So the family council can be a way to sort of provide some governance rules and so on to the family room activities. It can also be a really good way for learning some of these ideas, learning how to have difficult conversations, bringing in sort of outside experts, or just reading books together to build up your skills and capacity. I really believe this is something that people get better at with practice, get better at with some guidance.
I think that's great. And I think that earlier in one of your slides, you talked about clearly identifying roles. And I think that's what I'm hearing you say a lot too in that answer, is that if we understand what each of our roles are in the family and in the family council, we're going to be more inclined to not try to solve somebody else's problem.
That's it. Absolutely.
All right, a couple more questions here. Got a great comment here. How might you navigate intentionally encouraging family member individuation? I'm just reading as is here.
Yeah.
When the quest for legitimacy will clearly ignite conflict in the planned for family system, ownership, transition planning, government's decision making. Did you catch that question?
Yeah, Kim, thanks for a nice softball there. Always nice to see you again. I think the reality is that these processes, as you know too, are kind of happening whether you plan for them or not. There's sort of this process of everyone kind of looking for it, and when we sort of ignore it, it tends to not go away, but just go underground and resurface in other ways. So I think it's really about trying to get clear about how these processes work, and sort of the transition planning is a great example of that. It's natural and normal for someone to want to feel like they're having some success that's driven by them, not just because they want to be known for their first name, not by their last name. Putting in place good feedback and mechanisms and so on to help manage these kinds of processes. So much longer answer. It's a great question. But I think just realizing that this is part of the dynamic, and how do you sort of, find ways for people to have their own space in a healthy way, as opposed to pushing for it in an unhealthy way.
Thank you. And a question came back on that book, by the way. The person found that book by 2 different authors, Chris Warner.
It's Chris Warner is the one.
Chris Warner. Okay. Chris Warner is the answer to that. All right. A couple more here. And then we'll wrap it up here. How does one sensitize the family to the Goldilocks zone, considering families avoid conflict like the plague? I was kind of
Well,
thinking
I
the
mean,
same questions. How do I know when I've got just
yeah.
enough or not enough conflict?
Well, and I think to Aisha's point, like this, that is the standard way people deal with conflict in more families, is they try to avoid it rather than kind of managing it. And look, I think that it starts in part by sort of awareness is really helpful. I think that, you know, in general, so many families have sort of come to me and said, you know, we must be the whatever blank, the craziest, the most difficult, you know, the most challenging situation. And of course, the answer is no. It's just you're a family, and you have lots of love and wonderful things, and you wouldn't be in this position unless you've been really successful and made lots of good decisions. And you have this stuff that is sort of built into a family, to any family, and then you layer on the business, and it's really hard. And so I think, to me, the starting point is just to sort of go to conferences like this, or, you know, talk to webinars like this, go to conferences, talk to people, read cases and examples. You'll soon realize that this is very, very normal, and starting to sort of say, look, you know, if we avoid these issues, let's go talk to families that have done this and done that and ask them how that went. And usually not very well. It eventually finds its way to come out. So there's really no, to me, you know, it can be very isolating to be part of a family business. Try as much as you can to get out into the world in whatever way feels comfortable. You will so soon find that other people have dealt with this. And as you build up your library of experiences, you'll start to say, I know we don't want to talk about this, but let's remember the Jones family, and they didn't talk about this, and now they don't talk to each other, right? So getting out there can be really helpful.
A couple of people have asked, and I'll just answer here to everyone. Yes, we will have this. It's recorded now. We will be putting this up on our First Stop Bank website, the Center for Family-Owned Businesses site. So for those that want to see this recording or share it with others, it'll be up on our site within the next few days. One scenario here, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah.
So here's a scenario, and the person's asking what your recommendation would be in this situation. Dad has been a licensed, bonded, insured general contractor for 35 years. The only brother that wants to continue the business and work with Dad for 15 plus years and wants to adopt Dad's license doesn't have the most business acumen. So Dad's resistant to transfer the license to him. Any recommendations?
Yeah, I mean, this sounds like a classic example of often where we kind of avoid the issue, and we sort of, that message, you know, I guess my first question is that a message that this brother has ever really had before? You know, would he be surprised to know that this is being said? Or is this kind of, you know, a clear issue that's very much on the table? And I feel like once it's on the table, then you can start to talk about the alternatives. Maybe, and we don't really know for sure, is this person, you know, really good as a contractor, but just not a great business person? Well, you know, pair that person. You know, most people are only good at some things. They're successful because they find their opposite in business and collaborate with them. Or you can put in place like a board of directors or advisors. It doesn't have to be like a very complicated thing, but just some oversight to make sure that that person's making sound business decisions. You get them a coach. So once the problem is on the table, I think it's very solvable if everyone wants to solve it. If it's one of those things that we're kind of, you know, not really ever talking about, we're kind of moving around the edges, then it becomes a real challenge. And those are the kinds of issues that tend to get more and more entrenched. And then we tend to get very drastic solutions as opposed to the more evolutionary problem solving oriented approaches. So I think the key is to find some way, some constructive way for that conversation to start to happen. And you can either, if it's hard to do directly, you know, bringing in a coach or having someone do a performance review or an appraisal, or using the board if you have one, the independent directors. That's one of the reasons they're so useful. All these are ways to try to start to have a conversation that, if you don't have it, I promise you will not get better through avoidance.
Excellent, Josh. Thanks again. Your time is invaluable. So many comments are pouring in through my text messages, on our chat, thanking us for bringing you to our family business, family, if you will, those that we're working with. Love to just, again, thank you. And again, Josh's contact information was in the presentation. We will send it out to everyone when we send this video out. We will be posting this again on the First Stop Bank /family business website. Josh will be again presenting to our Family Business Symposium next month in Santa Barbara. Time is short to register for that. If you have any questions on that, you can reach out to me. More questions are coming in. We won't have time to get to those right now, but I will look at those and we will be in constant touch with Josh and get those questions to him and then get answers out to you. Just a reminder that we do these webinars now coming up every other month. The idea is to bring these tools and ideas to you, the family business owner, and also many of you that have been with us today counsel with family-owned businesses. You work with many family businesses, and so we are a resource and a tool for you as well. Other tools and resources that we have available through the First Bank Center for Family-Owned Businesses include all of the webinars that we've done that are all stored on our website, podcasts that we host, a lot of research, a lot of articles. We do an annual family business survey, which will be coming up again here in the next few weeks. If you'd like to participate or learn more, you can simply just go to first.bank/family business. All of those resources and tools are right there for you. My contact information, Mike Dierberg, our chairman, Joe Ambrose, our executive director, our entire team. We're here to support you, the family business owner. And once again, we want to thank the dozens and dozens of you who are on with us today. We also had a lot of other questions. And most importantly, Josh, thank you again for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you, my friend, next month in Santa Barbara. And the rest of you, our November webinar, November the 8th, will be on cyber protection and fraud protection. It's been a big issue that many of us have seen across the country. We're going to address it head on with some great experts. You won't want to miss that. That information is coming soon. So again, thank you so much for choosing to spend this hour with us today. And Josh, again, very grateful for you and your time and your wisdom today. Thank you, everyone.